Latin has two different voices. Oh, I got you right off the bat with some grammatical jargon. So voice, yeah, active or passive. Or in other words, for an active voice verb, the subject does the action, while for a passive voice verb, the subject receives the action. But what if that's just a little too simple for Latin? What if there's something more? So let's talk about deponent verbs, the little bit of complexity around this active and passive voice thing. We identify the different voices by means of a verb's ending. So for instance, the passive personal endings eris, ter, mer, mini, unter are different from the active ones, o, the letter s and t, than mus, tis, and unt. Or sometimes we do something completely different for each voice, like in the perfect tense, where the active voice has the e, isti, it, imus, istis, erunt endings, while the passive voice has the perfect participle with the sum, es est, sumus, estis, sunt. And if you need a refresher on this, please go ahead and watch one of my other videos on, well, the passive conjugations, especially for the present and perfect tenses. In a sentence with an active voice verb, the subject does the action. Custodes captivos custodiunt. The guards guard the prisoners. But in a sentence with a passive voice verb, the subject receives the action. Captivi a custodibus custodiuntur. The prisoners are guarded by the guards. You should have a basic understanding of voice because I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the passive voice and passive forms. So that's how voice works for most verbs, but not deponent verbs. I'm going to keep our active and passive sentence up, but add a third, this time with what we call a deponent verb. Custodes captivos sequuntur. The guards follow the prisoners. Note that the sentence structure looks a lot like our active sentence with the nominative and accusative forms, but the verb itself looks like the passive custodiuntur with that untur ending. In other words, while the deponent verb itself looks passive, it has an active meaning. The term deponent comes from the Latin verb deponere, meaning to set aside. Deponent verbs have, as the saying goes, set aside their passive meanings while keeping their passive forms. But apart from that, deponents follow the regular rules around conjugating a verb with passive forms. It's just their meaning that's different. You recognize a deponent in the dictionary because it's typically listed with three forms, all of them passive. So hortor, hortari, hortatus sum, which means to urge. Our first principal part is still the first person singular, the I form, I urge, of the present tense, and note the or passive ending. The second principal part is the present infinitive, to urge, but again, note the passive infinitive ending in ari. And finally, we have the first person singular, the I form again, of the perfect tense, I urged or I have urged. Deponents will always have these endings, although sometimes the sum is omitted, so be on the lookout for them. You can also learn the conjugation number of a deponent verb, the group the deponent verb belongs to, by checking out the second principal part. The present infinitive endings for deponents are different for each conjugation. So hortor, hortari, hortatus sum is in the first conjugation with that ari. Polikeor, polikeri, policitus sum is in the second conjugation. Sequor, sequi, secutus sum is in the third. And partior, partiri, partitus sum is in the fourth conjugation. Over half of all deponent verbs are in the first conjugation, but it's important to know the most common deponents in Latin. These words, grouped by conjugation number, should be considered core vocabulary, the important ones. And here are the first conjugation verbs, the second conjugation verbs, the third conjugation verbs, and the fourth conjugation verbs. So let's run through some examples with these verbs in different tenses. In talking about seasons, we could say, autumnus aestatem sequitur. Autumn follows summer. And our deponent verb sequitur has an active meaning, follows. Sacerdos vera loquitur. The priest says true things. Loquitur is a present tense deponent verb, so we want to be sure to translate it actively, speaks or says. Omnes duces cum sceptris curiam ingrediebantur. All the leaders would enter the curia, or court, with scepters. Ingrediebantur is in the imperfect tense, note the ba infix, but it's active in meaning, and we could easily replace it with an active verb like intrabant, without any change in meaning. And this one is from Caesar. Caesar conatus est reficere pontes. Caesar tried to repair the bridges. The deponent verb is conatus est, and while it looks like it should be translated was tried or has been tried, we read it with an active meaning, just tried. Caesar is doing the action here. And here's one more. A couple of times the historian Livy has the phrase qui priore anno mortuus erat, which has the pluperfect deponent verb mortuus erat. We would translate this as who had died in the year before. The standard rule is that deponents look passive but have active meanings in English. But this rule breaks down when we look at participles. The present participle looks like a present active participle, and it has an active meaning, so it looks active with active meanings, since there is no present passive participle. Sequens, following, as in lupus agnon sequens tacitus erat. The wolf, following or while following the lamb, was quiet. The perfect participle looks like a perfect passive participle, but it has an active meaning, so it looks passive with active meanings, the standard rule for deponents. This is sometimes called a perfect active participle, and Latin authors seem to know about its special qualities, because remember that the perfect participle is regularly passive in meaning, so if you wanted to use a perfect participle with an active sense, you could find a deponent participle to use. So, Cadmus boum secutus agit grates. Cadmus, having followed the cow, gives thanks. Cadmus, the founder of the Greek city Thebes, with this sacred cow having shown him where to do it, is doing the action of secutus, even though it's a perfect participle and happened prior to his giving thanks. The future participle looks active with an active meaning. So we could say puer fratres secuturus est. The boy is going to follow his brothers, from Seneca. And finally, the gerundive has a passive form and a passive meaning. So in this passive periphrastic, hoc confitendum est, this must be acknowledged, the deponent gerundive confitendum has a passive meaning, and the hoc, the this, is receiving the action. Now there's a group of verbs called semi-deponents. Semi means half, and so these verbs are regular in the present, imperfect, and future tenses, the so-called present system tenses, but deponent in the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, the tenses of the perfect system. So they look passive in the perfect tenses, but still have active meanings. There are four common and important semi-deponents: audeo, audere, ausus sum, and note the present active forms in the first two principal parts, but the passive or deponent-looking third part. So this first word means to dare, fido, fidere, fisus sum, to trust. Gaudeo, gaudere, gauisus sum, to rejoice, and soleo, solere, solitus sum, to be accustomed. So you might say, Claudia saltare audet, Claudia dares to dance, but when we move this thought into the perfect tense, we now have a passive-looking form of the verb. Claudia saltare ausa est. Claudia dared or has dared to dance. Again, the verb ausa est looks passive, but we keep its active meaning. Deponent verbs are a tough concept to teach and learn. As a teacher, I work hard to have my students learn about voice, only to turn around and tell them that there are certain verbs that completely break this rule. It can be what gives Latin a bad name for being overly difficult. The passive voice is hard, and deponent verbs are an important and large subset of verbs that throw everything into confusion. It's like I've lied to my students. So why do deponents even exist? Okay, let's go back to voice for the explanation. There's the active voice, where the subject does the action, and the passive voice, where the subject receives the action. But some languages, and ancient Greek is one example, have a third voice, something in the middle between active and passive called, well, the middle voice. That's a great name, right? Where the subject kind of does and receives the action at the same time, or is reflexive in nature. Think of a phrase like, the door opened, or the window broke, or the wine sold well. In all of these, the subject is kind of doing the action and receiving it at the same time. And yeah, this is a bit simplistic, but it doesn't really matter because Latin doesn't have the middle voice. It used to, though, in what we would call Proto-Latin, and some suggest that the passive voice in Latin evolved out of some middle forms. Deponents themselves, looking passive with active meanings, are theorized to actually be these middle voice forms, now felt with an entirely active sense. So, for instance, the deponent verb weisgor can mean I eat, but it's more accurately something like I feed myself, where I'm both doing and receiving. Not all deponents are this easy to reason out in meaning, but I hope this gives a good explanation for why we see deponent verbs in Latin. They're kind of like a relic of an earlier time. So, in review, deponent verbs look passive but have active meanings. We can identify a deponent verb by its dictionary form, and sometimes we can also reason out that a verb is deponent by its greater context. The subject does the action of a deponent verb, and you can see accusative direct objects with deponents, while a passive verb wouldn't really have an accusative direct object, and sometimes is accompanied by an ablative. Participles for deponents break this look passive with active meanings rule in the present and future tenses. And there also exist semi-deponent verbs, which are regular in the present system of tenses, but deponent in the perfect system.